used to think if I just stayed quieter about my inheritance, made fewer demands about what was rightfully mine, and let my sister take credit for things she didn't earn, maybe my family would finally stop treating me like an obstacle to her success. But no matter how much I sacrificed or how often I stepped aside, in the Whitmore household, Brooke's ambitions would always matter more than my legal rights. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Cassandra Whitmore, and growing up in the rolling hills of Millfield County meant living in a family where my sister's charm and manipulation were mistaken for leadership, while my quiet integrity was dismissed as lack of drive. The Whitmore family owned a sprawling colonial farmhouse on Heritage Lane, surrounded by 300 acres of prime agricultural land that had been in our family for 4 generations. My father, Daniel, worked as a real estate attorney in the county seat, ironically, a profession that should have made him more aware of the importance of proper property documentation. My mother, Ruth, managed the family's various business interests while maintaining the social connections that had helped build the Whitmore reputation in Millfield County. Brooke was 18 months older than me, blessed with the kind of aggressive confidence that adults often mistook for natural leadership ability. At 22, she had a degree in business administration and a talent for convincing people that her ideas were not only brilliant, but inevitable. To our parents, Brooke was the future of the Whitmore family legacy. To me, she was a master manipulator who had learned early that taking what she wanted was easier than earning it. The favoritism in our family had always been rationalized as practical business sense. Brooke was the natural entrepreneur who would carry on the family's commercial success. I was the dreamy one who preferred books to balance sheets and therefore couldn't be trusted with serious financial responsibility. But the foundation of this family mythology rested on a lie that would take me years to uncover. When I was 16 and Brooke was 18, our maternal grandmother, Dorothy Richardson, passed away after a long illness. Grandma Dorothy had been the one person in my extended family who truly understood me. She'd been a teacher before marriage, valued education and quiet thoughtfulness, and had always encouraged my academic interests over Brooke's social climbing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Grandma Dorothy had lived alone on a beautiful 50-acre property in the Oakwood Hills section of Millfield County, about 20 minutes from our family farm. The property included a restored Victorian house, several outbuildings, and some of the most scenic farmland in the region. More importantly, it was completely paid off and worth well over $500,000. The day after the funeral, our family gathered in Dad's home office to discuss Grandma Dorothy's estate. I was still grieving and not particularly interested in financial details, but Brooke was asking pointed questions about property values and inheritance timelines. The good news is, Dad announced, that Dorothy left everything very clearly organized. No disputes, no complications. What did she leave to whom? Brooke asked immediately. Dad pulled out a folder of documents. The house and property go to Cassie, along with Dorothy's savings accounts and investment portfolio. Brooke, you inherit Dorothy's jewelry collection and her antique furniture. I looked up in surprise. The whole property goes to me? That's what Dorothy wanted, Dad confirmed. She felt you had a deeper connection to the land and would be more likely to preserve its character. Brooke's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, calculation, and finally, forced acceptance. "That's wonderful for Cassie," she said, though her smile looked strained. I'm sure Grandma Dorothy knew what she was doing. At 16, I had no real understanding of the property's value or the responsibility that came with inheriting 50 acres of prime real estate. I was sad about losing Grandma Dorothy and overwhelmed by the idea that she'd entrusted me with her most precious possession. Of course, you're too young to manage property ownership right now, Dad continued. We'll set up a trust structure where the property is held for you until you turn 21. In the meantime, the family will handle maintenance and taxes. What does that mean exactly? I asked. It means the property technically belongs to you, but we'll take care of all the practical aspects until you're old enough to handle them yourself. This arrangement seemed reasonable to my 16-year-old mind. I trusted my family to protect my inheritance while I finished high school and started college. That trust would prove to be catastrophically misplaced. Over the next few years, I noticed that family conversations about the property increasingly treated it as a general family asset rather than my specific inheritance. When neighbors inquired about the Victorian house, Dad would refer to it as our family property in Oakwood Hills. When local developers expressed interest in purchasing land for new housing developments, the discussions included Brooke as if she were a co-owner. We're not ready to sell any of the Oakwood Hills property, Dad would tell potential buyers, but we'll keep your offers in mind for future consideration. The casual use of we always bothered me, but when I asked about it, Dad would assure me that he was just handling the business aspects until I was ready to take over. Don't worry about the details, Cassie. Your inheritance is safe. We're just managing things professionally until you're mature enough to make informed decisions.
But I started noticing other things that didn't align with Dad's reassurances. Mail addressed to the Oakwood Hills property was delivered to our family farmhouse and handled by Dad or Brooke. Property tax bills were paid from the family business account rather than from any trust fund set up for my inheritance. And most tellingly, when Brooke graduated college and started talking about her business plans, those plans increasingly involved developing the family property portfolio. I'm thinking about starting a small boutique hotel, Brooke mentioned during a family dinner when I was 19. The Victorian house in Oakwood Hills would be perfect for conversion to a high-end bed and breakfast. That's an interesting idea, Mom said encouragingly. The location is certainly beautiful enough. Wait, I interjected. That's my property. Shouldn't I be involved in decisions about what happens to it? Of course you should, Brooke replied smoothly. I'm just brainstorming possibilities. Nothing would happen without your approval. But the way she said your approval made it sound like a formality rather than a requirement. And the family's enthusiastic discussion of her business plans continued as if my ownership of the property was a minor detail to be managed rather than a fundamental fact. When I turned 21, I expected to receive full control of my inheritance, as Dad had originally promised. Instead, I got a series of excuses and delays. The trust paperwork is more complicated than we anticipated. There are some tax implications we need to resolve before transferring full ownership. What kind of tax implications? Nothing serious, just some estate planning strategies that could save the family money in the long run. But the property is mine, right? Regardless of tax strategies? Of course it's yours. We're just making sure the transfer is handled in the most advantageous way possible. This pattern of vague reassurances continued for months. Every time I asked for specific timelines or documentation, I was told that the lawyers were working on it or that there were a few more details to resolve. Meanwhile, Brooke's bed and breakfast plans were becoming increasingly detailed and public. She'd started meeting with contractors about renovation costs, researching permits for commercial use, and even talking to local tourism boards about marketing strategies. I'm so excited about this project, she told friends and family members. Converting the family property into a boutique hotel will be such a wonderful way to share its beauty with visitors. The casual reference to the family property was becoming standard language, as if Grandma Dorothy had left the land to all of us rather than specifically to me. When I turned 22, I decided to take action. I made an appointment with an independent attorney, not someone connected to Dad's firm, to discuss my inheritance and the delayed property transfer. Attorney Michael Lawson reviewed the documents I brought and asked several pointed questions about the timeline and the trust arrangement. Cassie, I need to tell you something concerning, he said after examining Grandma Dorothy's will and the trust paperwork. This trust structure was supposed to be temporary, terminating automatically when you turned 21. There's no legal basis for the continued delay in transferring full ownership to you. So I should already have complete control of the property? You should have had complete control over a year ago. The fact that your family is still managing the property and making decisions about its use suggests either incompetence or deliberate obstruction. What should I do? Request immediate transfer of the deed and all property documentation. If they refuse or continue to delay, you may need to consider legal action to protect your inheritance. That evening, I confronted Dad with Mr. Lawson's assessment. Dad, I've learned that the trust was supposed to end when I turned 21. I need you to transfer the property deed to me immediately. Dad's expression shifted from surprise to irritation. Cassie, you don't understand the complexities involved here. Rushing into full property ownership without proper planning could have serious financial consequences. What complexities? The will was clear, and the trust had a specific termination date. There are ongoing business considerations, tax implications, and family planning strategies that require coordination. Whose business considerations? It's my property. It's more complicated than that. The property is part of the family's overall estate planning, and precipitous changes could affect everyone's financial situation. The conversation was a masterclass in gaslighting. Dad was using his legal expertise to make my straightforward inheritance sound impossibly complex, requiring his continued management for my own protection. I want to see the actual trust documents and the current deed, I said firmly. Cassie, you're not trained to interpret legal documents. You could misunderstand something important. Then explain them to me. Show me exactly where it says you have the authority to continue managing my property past my 21st birthday. Dad's reluctance to provide documentation was answer enough. Something was wrong with the legal structure he'd created, and he was hoping I wouldn't have the knowledge or persistence to challenge it. Over the next several weeks, I discovered the extent of the problem. The trust documents were vaguely worded in ways that gave Dad broad discretionary authority over the property. The annual tax payments were being deducted from my inheritance funds rather than being covered separately. And, most alarmingly, Brooke had been included in several property-related legal documents as if she were a co-beneficiary, rather than someone who had inherited completely different assets. When I demanded answers, the family's response was to frame my questions as evidence of immaturity and ingratitude. Cassie's going through a phase where she's suspicious of everyone, Mom told relatives who asked about family tensions. She's convinced we're trying to steal her inheritance, which is hurtful after everything we've done to protect it for her. Maybe if Cassie showed more interest in the family business and less interest in making accusations, she'd understand how property management actually works, Brooke added with her characteristic blend of condescension and fake concern.
The message was clear. My desire to control my own inheritance was being reframed as paranoid selfishness that threatened family harmony. But I'd learned enough about property law from Mr. Lawson to understand that family harmony shouldn't require me to surrender control of assets that legally belong to me. The breaking point came during my 23rd birthday dinner, when Brooke announced that she'd secured financing for her bed and breakfast project and would be starting renovations on the family property within the next few months. I'm so grateful that we can all work together to create something special with Grandma Dorothy's legacy, she said, raising her wine glass in a toast. Wait, I said, setting down my fork. You're starting renovations on my property without my permission? Our property, Brooke corrected gently. And of course I have permission. Dad and I have been planning this project for over a year. Dad doesn't have the authority to give you permission to develop my inheritance. Cassie, the property benefits the whole family, Dad interjected. Brooke's business plan will generate income that helps everyone. Generate income for whom? I own the property. Any business income should come to me. You'll receive your fair share, Brooke assured me. This is a partnership that benefits all of us. I never agreed to any partnership. I inherited that property outright. The room fell silent, and I could see my family exchanging glances that suggested I was being unreasonable. Cassie, Mom said gently, maybe we should discuss this privately rather than during your birthday celebration. No, let's discuss it now. I want to understand exactly how Brooke thinks she has the right to develop property that belongs to me. Because family assets should be managed for the benefit of the whole family, Brooke replied, with the patience of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow child. Grandma Dorothy wouldn't have wanted her property to just sit empty while family members struggle financially. Grandma Dorothy left the property to me specifically. If she wanted it managed for the whole family, she would have structured her will differently. Maybe her will doesn't reflect what she would have wanted if she'd understood the full financial picture, Dad suggested. The audacity was breathtaking. Dad was essentially arguing that he knew better than Grandma Dorothy what she should have done with her own property. That night, I called Mr. Lawson and explained what had happened during dinner. Cassie, this situation has moved beyond family disagreement into potential fraud territory, he said. If Brooke is planning to develop property that legally belongs to you using financing secured without your consent, that could constitute theft and fraud. What should I do? Document everything. Get copies of all property records from the county assessor's office and consider filing a lawsuit to clarify ownership and prevent unauthorized development. A lawsuit against my own family? A lawsuit to protect your inheritance from people who are treating it as their own property. The fact that they're related to you doesn't give them the right to steal from you. The next morning, I drove to the Millfield County Assessor's office to request copies of all documents related to the Oakwood Hills property. What I discovered there would shatter my understanding of my family and set in motion a chain of events that would expose years of deception and manipulation. Because the woman behind the counter, County Assessor Linda Morrison, took one look at my request and said something that changed everything. Are you sure you have the right property address? Because according to our records, Brooke Whitmore is listed as the current owner of that parcel. I called Mr. Lawson immediately. Michael, I need to see you right away. I think my family has committed deed fraud. What did you discover? I explained about the county records showing Brooke as the property owner and the transfer documents that I'd never seen before. Bring everything to my office immediately, he said. Don't discuss this with your family until we've reviewed the documentation. If there's been fraud, we need to preserve the evidence and report it properly. The drive to Mr. Lawson's office felt surreal. I kept thinking about all the family conversations where Dad and Brooke had discussed managing my inheritance. All the delays and excuses about transferring ownership, all the casual references to family property that I'd dismissed as poor word choice rather than deliberate deception. They hadn't been managing my inheritance. They'd been covering up the theft of it. Mr. Lawson examined the transfer documents with the focused intensity of someone who specialized in property law. After 20 minutes, he looked up with a grim expression. Cassie, this is definitely fraud. The signature analysis alone shows clear inconsistencies with your verified signature from other documents. But more importantly, the witness requirements weren't properly met, and the notarization appears to have been backdated. What does that mean? It means someone created these documents to make an illegal property transfer look legitimate. Your sister now holds a deed that was obtained through forged documents. What should I do? We need to file a police report immediately. Property fraud of this magnitude is a serious felony that could result in prison time for everyone involved. Prison time? Cassie, we're talking about the theft of property worth over $500,000. This isn't a family disagreement. It's grand theft and document fraud. The drive home from Mr. Lawson's office was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I kept trying to imagine how I would confront my family with evidence of their crimes, what I would say to parents who had betrayed my trust so completely, how I would face Brooke knowing she'd been planning to develop stolen property. When I walked into our family farmhouse, everyone was gathered in the kitchen for dinner as if nothing had happened. Dad was discussing some client case with Mom, Brooke was scrolling through her phone, and the scene looked perfectly normal except for the stack of fraud documents in my hand. How was your day, sweetie? Mom asked as I entered the kitchen. Interesting, I replied, setting the documents on the kitchen table. I learned that Brooke is officially the owner of Grandma Dorothy's property. The room went completely silent. Dad's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Brooke's phone disappeared into her lap. Mom's smile froze in place. "What are you talking about?" Dad asked carefully. "I went to the county assessor's office to get copies of the property records. According to official documentation, I transferred ownership of my inheritance to Brooke 18 months ago." "Well, that's part of the estate planning we discussed," Dad said, his lawyer training kicking in. "The transfer was designed to optimize the family's financial situation." "I never signed any transfer documents." "Of course you did. You were there when we went through all the paperwork." "Dad, I was never there. I never signed anything. I never even saw these documents until today." I pulled out the deed transfer and placed it in front of him. "This signature is forged. The witnesses are fabricated, and the notarization is backdated." "Brooke?" Finally, Brooke looked up from her lap. "Cassie, you're being paranoid. Of course you signed the transfer, you just don't remember because it was part of a lot of legal paperwork." "I don't remember because it never happened. I was in class the day this was supposedly signed." Memory can be unreliable when you're dealing with stressful legal processes. Sometimes people block out experiences that feel overwhelming. The gaslighting was immediate and coordinated. Within minutes, my family had constructed an alternative reality where I had voluntarily signed away my inheritance, but had somehow forgotten or repressed the memory. "Are you seriously suggesting that I have amnesia about signing away $500,000 worth of property?" "We're suggesting that you might be confused about the timeline or the specific documents," Mom said gently. "Legal processes can be very overwhelming." "Then explain this." I pulled out my university attendance records. These show I was in class the entire day the transfer was supposedly signed. I couldn't have been in two places at once. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't confusion or surprise. It was the silence of people who had been caught in a lie and were calculating their next move. "Cassie, I think you need to understand something. The transfer was necessary to protect the family's financial interests. If the property had stayed in your name, it would have created tax liabilities that could have affected everyone." "So you committed fraud to avoid paying taxes?" "We restructured assets to optimize the family's financial position," Dad corrected. "It's a standard estate planning strategy." "Standard estate planning strategies don't involve forging signatures and filing false documents with the county. You're making serious accusations based on what might be simple misunderstandings," Dad said, his voice taking on the warning tone I recognized from childhood. "I'm stating facts based on documentary evidence. The signature is forged, the witnesses are fabricated, and you've stolen my inheritance." "That's enough," Dad said sharply. "You're obviously upset, but throwing around accusations of theft and fraud is unacceptable." "What's unacceptable is stealing property that belongs to me." "Lower your voice," Mom said nervously, glancing toward the windows as if concerned about neighbors overhearing. "No, I won't lower my voice. You've all been lying to me for years about my inheritance, and now I find out you've actually stolen it through document fraud." "Cassie, you need to calm down and think about what you're saying," Brooke said, using the patronizing tone she'd perfected over years of getting her way. "These are serious accusations that could hurt people."
"These are serious crimes that have already hurt me." "What crimes?" Dad demanded. "Show me evidence of any crimes." I pulled out Mr. Lawson's analysis of the forged documents, his comparison of the signatures, and his assessment of the legal violations involved. "A property attorney has confirmed that these documents contain forged signatures, fabricated witnesses, and fraudulent notarization. You've committed multiple felonies." Dad glanced through Mr. Lawson's analysis, his expression growing darker with each page. "Michael Lawson is hardly an objective observer," he said dismissively. "He's trying to create a case where none exists so he can collect legal fees." "So now you're claiming that an independent attorney is fabricating evidence for money?" "I'm saying that Michael has a financial incentive to convince you that there's been wrongdoing, even when there hasn't been." The circular logic was dizzying. My family had committed fraud, but the evidence of fraud was dismissed as the invention of lawyers seeking profit. Fine, I said, gathering up the documents. If you think Mr. Lawson is lying about the fraud, maybe you'll take the police more seriously. The police? Mom's voice cracked. Property fraud is a felony. If you won't voluntarily correct the fraudulent transfer, I'll file criminal charges. Cassie, you don't want to involve law enforcement in a family matter, Dad said, his lawyer instincts clearly recognizing the seriousness of the threat. This stopped being a family matter when you forged my signature and stole my property. Think about what you're threatening to do, Brooke said, tears starting to form in her eyes. You're talking about sending your own family to prison over a misunderstanding about paperwork. I'm talking about reporting crimes that have been committed against me. The fact that the criminals are related to me doesn't make the crimes less serious. Cassie, Dad said, his voice becoming more authoritative, I want you to understand the implications of what you're considering. If you file false criminal charges against your family, you could face legal consequences yourself. False charges? I have documentary evidence of fraud. You have misinterpreted legal documents and the uninformed opinion of an attorney who isn't familiar with our family's estate planning. Then show me the documents that prove I voluntarily transferred my inheritance. Show me my real signature on papers I actually remember signing. We don't have to prove anything to you, Dad said coldly. The transfer is legally recorded and properly documented, with forged signatures and fabricated witnesses, with legal documentation that reflects the family's estate planning decisions. The conversation was going in circles, with my family denying obvious evidence while offering increasingly elaborate explanations for their actions. It was clear that they had no intention of admitting wrongdoing or correcting the fraudulent transfer. I need to ask you all a direct question, I said, looking around the table at each of them. Are you planning to return my inheritance voluntarily, or do I need to pursue legal action to recover stolen property? There's nothing to return, Brooke said firmly. The property transfer was legitimate, and I'm the legal owner. Based on forged documents. Based on proper estate planning that you apparently don't understand or remember. Then we're done here, I said, standing up from the table. I'll be filing criminal charges tomorrow morning. Cassie, wait, Mom said desperately. Can't we work this out as a family? You had 3 years to work this out as a family. Instead, you chose to commit fraud and steal from me. We chose to manage family assets in a way that benefits everyone, Dad corrected. You chose to forge my signature and transfer my property without my knowledge or consent. That's theft, not management. Where are you going? Brooke asked as I headed toward the door. To stay somewhere that I don't have to worry about family members stealing from me while I sleep. The drive to Mr. Lawson's office the next morning felt like entering a different world, one where evidence mattered more than family loyalty and where crimes had consequences regardless of who committed them. Are you sure you want to proceed with criminal charges? He asked after I had described the previous evening's confrontation. They made it clear that they have no intention of returning my property voluntarily. What other option do I have? Legal action will likely destroy your relationship with your family permanently. My relationship with my family was destroyed the moment they decided to steal from me. I'm just acknowledging that reality. This is going to be a difficult process. Your family has resources and will likely hire expensive attorneys to fight the charges. Good. Let them explain to a jury why they thought it was acceptable to forge my signature and steal $500,000 worth of property. Mr. Lawson nodded grimly. Then let's file the police report and start the process of recovering your inheritance. As we prepared the criminal complaint, I reflected on how completely my understanding of my family had shifted. For years, I'd accepted their explanations about protecting my inheritance, managing my assets, and optimizing the family's financial position. I'd trusted them to act in my best interests, even when their actions seemed suspicious. But faced with undeniable evidence of fraud, they'd chosen to deny reality rather than admit wrongdoing. They'd preferred to gaslight me about my own memory and question my mental state rather than return property they'd stolen through forged documents. The family I'd grown up in had been built on lies, and the people I trusted most had been systematically betraying that trust for years. But I was done being the accommodating daughter who sacrificed her own interests for family harmony. I was done accepting explanations that didn't make sense and trusting people who had proven themselves untrustworthy. Tomorrow, Linda Morrison at the county assessor's office would be receiving a visit from law enforcement officers investigating deed fraud. And my family was about to discover that some betrayals have consequences that can't be managed, minimized, or explained away.
The quiet daughter they'd been stealing from was about to become the prosecutor's star witness in a felony fraud case. Filing the police report at the Millfield County Sheriff's Department was both terrifying and liberating. Detective Sarah Chen, who specialized in white-collar crimes, listened carefully as I explained the situation and reviewed the documentary evidence Mr. Lawson had prepared. Property fraud cases involving family members are always complex, Detective Chen said after examining the forged transfer documents. But the evidence you've presented is quite compelling. Forged signatures, fabricated witnesses, backdated notarization. These are serious felonies. What happens next? We'll open a formal investigation. I'll need to interview the notary listed on the fraudulent transfer documents, verify the witness statements, and conduct a handwriting analysis of the signatures. We'll also need to examine all related financial records to determine if this is part of a larger pattern of fraud. A larger pattern? When people commit document fraud on this scale, it's rarely an isolated incident. We'll need to review all property transactions, financial transfers, and legal documents involving your family to see if there are other victims or other fraudulent activities. The scope of the investigation was broader than I'd anticipated, but Detective Chen explained that thoroughness was essential in building a strong case. Your family will likely hire expensive attorneys and immediately begin a campaign to discredit both the investigation and your motives for initiating it, she warned. We need to make sure our evidence is ironclad before we proceed with formal charges. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched the investigation unfold with a mixture of anxiety and fascination. Detective Chen was methodical and professional, treating the case with the seriousness it deserved regardless of the family relationships involved. The first breakthrough came when she interviewed the notary listed on the fraudulent transfer documents. James Patterson, a semi-retired notary who worked part-time at various law offices, had no memory of notarizing any documents for the Whitmore family. I keep detailed records of every notarization I perform. I've never notarized anything for Daniel Whitmore or his family. If my seal appears on documents I didn't notarize, someone has forged my notarization. The second breakthrough came from the handwriting analysis. A forensic document examiner confirmed that my signature on the deed transfer was a forgery, created by someone who had access to examples of my genuine signature but lacked the skill to replicate it convincingly. The forger tried to copy the basic letter shapes, but the pressure patterns, stroke sequences, and natural flow are completely different from the authentic signatures. This is definitely fraudulent. But the most significant discovery came when Detective Chen expanded her investigation to examine other property transactions involving my family. What she found was evidence of a systematic pattern of fraud that went far beyond stealing my inheritance. "Cassie, I need to show you something disturbing," Detective Chen said during one of our meetings. "We've discovered that this isn't the first time your family has manipulated property records." She pulled out a thick folder containing documents related to various real estate transactions over the past 5 years. "Your father has been involved in several questionable property transfers involving elderly clients of his law firm. In each case, valuable property was transferred to family members or business associates under circumstances that appear suspicious." What kind of suspicious circumstances? Elderly clients with dementia or serious illnesses suddenly deciding to transfer their property to people they barely knew. Signatures that don't match previous examples. Witnesses who claim they were present for document signings that occurred when they were actually out of town. The revelation was staggering. Dad hadn't just stolen my inheritance. He'd apparently been using his position as a lawyer to systematically fraud vulnerable elderly clients. How many victims are we talking about? At least 6 that we've identified so far.
The total value of fraudulently transferred property is approaching $3 million. $3 million? Your inheritance is just one piece of a much larger criminal enterprise. Your father has been using his legal expertise and professional reputation to commit fraud on a massive scale. Detective Chen explained that the investigation had attracted the attention of the state attorney general's office, which was now treating this as a major white-collar crime case with potential federal implications. Cassie, I want you to understand that this case is no longer just about recovering your property. We're looking at multiple felony charges against your father, possible criminal charges against your sister for her role in the fraud, and a comprehensive investigation of your family's business practices. The girl who had started this process simply wanting to reclaim her inheritance inadvertently exposed a criminal enterprise that had been operating for years. Meanwhile, my family's response to the criminal investigation was a masterclass in damage control and victim blaming. Dad hired Thompson, Bradley, and Associates, the most expensive criminal defense firm in the state, and immediately began a campaign to discredit both the investigation and my motives for initiating it. Cassie has always been troubled, he told relatives and family friends who asked about the criminal charges. She's struggling with mental health issues and has convinced herself that routine estate planning constitutes fraud. Brooke took a different approach, positioning herself as a victim of my vindictive behavior. I'm heartbroken that my own sister would try to destroy our family over a property dispute. I've tried to include her in the business planning, but she's determined to punish the family for not giving her complete control over assets she's not mature enough to manage. Mom attempted to play peacemaker, calling me repeatedly to beg for reconciliation. Cassie, please withdraw the charges, she pleaded during a particularly difficult phone call. We can work this out as a family without involving the legal system. Mom, there's nothing to work out. Dad committed multiple felonies and Brooke is in possession of stolen property. They made mistakes in judgment, but destroying the family won't fix anything.
I'm not destroying the family. I'm exposing crimes that were already committed. The destruction happened when Dad decided to steal from his own daughter and defraud his elderly clients. You don't understand the full picture. There were legitimate business reasons for the property transfers. There are no legitimate business reasons for forging signatures and filing false documents. These conversations always followed the same pattern. My family would acknowledge that mistakes had been made, while refusing to admit that crimes had been committed. They would frame my pursuit of justice as vindictive overreaction, while portraying themselves as victims of my unreasonable demands. But their narrative became harder to maintain as the investigation uncovered increasingly damning evidence. Linda Morrison, the county assessor who had first alerted me to the fraudulent property transfer, became an unexpected ally in the investigation. Her expertise in property records and her familiarity with normal versus suspicious transaction patterns proved invaluable. I've been working in property records for 15 years, she told Detective Chen during her formal interview. The Whitmore family transactions show clear patterns of document manipulation and fraudulent transfers. Linda had noticed irregularities in multiple property filings involving Dad's law firm, but hadn't had the authority to investigate until Detective Chen's criminal probe provided the necessary legal framework. Daniel Whitmore has been exploiting his position as a lawyer to manipulate property records in ways that would be impossible for ordinary citizens, Linda explained. He understands the filing procedures well enough to create fraudulent documents that pass initial review, but the patterns become obvious when you examine multiple transactions over time. Her testimony would prove crucial in establishing that Dad's fraud wasn't limited to my inheritance, but represented a systematic abuse of his professional position. As the investigation progressed, I found myself transformed from a confused victim into an informed advocate for justice. Detective Chen and Mr. Lawson educated me about the legal processes involved, the standards of evidence required, and the potential outcomes for the various charges being considered. Cassie, you've become one of the most knowledgeable witnesses I've worked with, Detective Chen told me after a particularly detailed interview session.
Your understanding of the evidence and your ability to explain the timeline clearly will be crucial if this case goes to trial. I never wanted to become an expert in property fraud. But now that you are, you're helping us build a case that could prevent other families from being victimized the same way yours was. The investigation also revealed the extent to which my family had underestimated both my intelligence and my determination. For years, they'd treated me as someone who could be easily manipulated through vague explanations and family pressure. They'd assumed I would never have the knowledge or persistence to challenge their fraudulent schemes. Your family's biggest mistake was assuming you wouldn't fight back, Mr. Lawson observed during one of our strategy sessions. They built their entire fraud around the assumption that you would accept whatever explanations they provided. I almost got away with it. They would have gotten away with it if you hadn't trusted your instincts and sought independent legal advice. Most people in your situation would have accepted the family's explanations and never discovered the fraud. 6 weeks into the investigation, Detective Chen called me with significant news. Cassie, we're ready to make arrests. The state attorney general has approved felony charges against your father for multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. Your sister will be charged with receiving stolen property and conspiracy to commit fraud. When will the arrests happen? Tomorrow morning. I wanted to give you advance notice because this will likely become public very quickly. What should I expect? Media attention, probably. Your father is a prominent attorney, and the scope of the fraud is significant enough to attract press coverage. You may want to prepare for questions from reporters. The idea of public attention was daunting. But I'd already crossed the line from private family dispute to criminal prosecution. There was no going back to the quiet accommodation that had characterized my relationship with my family for so long. That evening, I sat in the small apartment I'd rented after leaving the family home, reflecting on how completely my life had changed since discovering the fraud. 6 months ago, I'd been the accommodating daughter who trusted her family's management of her inheritance. Now, I was the key witness in a major criminal case that would likely send my father to prison and destroy my family's reputation in the community. But I felt no regret about the path I'd chosen. My family had committed serious crimes, not just against me, but against vulnerable elderly victims who had trusted Dad's professional integrity. They had chosen to build their wealth and status on a foundation of fraud and manipulation. The quiet daughter they'd been stealing from had become someone who understood that justice sometimes requires choosing truth over family loyalty. And tomorrow, when Detective Chen arrested Dad and Brooke, the community would learn that the respected Whitmore family had been built on lies that were finally being exposed. The investigation had revealed that I wasn't the only victim of my family's crimes, but I was the one who had refused to accept their explanations and had insisted on uncovering the truth. And that choice had transformed me from someone who doubted her own perceptions to someone who trusted her instincts enough to pursue justice regardless of the personal cost. The girl who had once asked for copies of property records just to understand her inheritance had become the woman whose persistence had exposed a criminal enterprise and whose testimony would help ensure that other families wouldn't suffer the same betrayal. Tomorrow would bring arrests, media attention, and the public revelation of everything my family had tried so desperately to hide. But tonight, for the first time in years, I felt like I knew exactly who I was and what I stood for.
And that knowledge was worth more than any property they could have stolen from me. The arrests happened at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. I wasn't there to witness them, but Detective Chen called me an hour later to confirm that both Dad and Brooke had been taken into custody without incident. Your father was arrested at his law office, she reported. Multiple counts of fraud, forgery, elder abuse, and conspiracy. Your sister was arrested at the family home on charges of receiving stolen property and conspiracy to commit fraud. How did they react? Your father immediately invoked his right to an attorney and refused to make any statements. Your sister seemed genuinely shocked and kept asking if this was really happening. Within hours, the arrests became front-page news in the Millfield County Herald. Prominent attorney arrested in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme, read the headline.
with a sidebar story titled, "Family Property Dispute Exposes Elder Abuse Ring." The media coverage was more extensive than I'd anticipated. Dad's prominence in the community, combined with the scope of the fraud and the involvement of elderly victims, made the story irresistible to local and regional news outlets. By noon, reporters were calling my apartment and Mr. Lawson's office, seeking interviews about the case. The story had all the elements that make for compelling news coverage: a respected professional's fall from grace, family betrayal, vulnerable elderly victims, and millions of dollars in stolen property. Cassie Whitmore, the attorney's daughter who exposed the fraud by seeking records of her own inheritance, has become the key witness in what prosecutors are calling one of the largest elder abuse cases in county history, reported WKML News that evening. Watching myself described on television as the person who had exposed the fraud was surreal. 6 months ago, I'd been the accommodating daughter who trusted my family's explanations about estate planning. Now I was being portrayed as a whistleblower who had helped protect vulnerable seniors from systematic exploitation. The media attention brought unexpected support from other families who had suspected their elderly relatives were being victimized by Dad's practice. "My grandmother transferred her property to some business associate of Daniel Whitmore's right before she died," one woman told reporters. "We always thought it was suspicious, but we didn't know how to challenge it. My father-in-law signed over his farm to people he'd never mentioned before. The documents were processed through Whitmore's law firm, and we were told it was too late to contest after he passed away." Detective Chen's investigation had opened the floodgates for other potential victims to come forward, turning my personal property dispute into a community-wide reckoning with systematic elder abuse. 3 days after the arrests, Mom called me for the first time since the charges were filed. "Cassie, we need to talk," she said, her voice strained and exhausted. "About what?" "About fixing this situation before it destroys everyone." We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop in downtown Millfield, where we were unlikely to encounter family friends or neighbors. Mom looked like she'd aged 5 years in the past week, her usual composed appearance replaced by obvious stress and sleepless nights. "Do you understand what you've done?" she asked without preamble. "I've reported crimes that were committed against me and other victims. You've destroyed your family over a property dispute that could have been resolved through civil litigation." "Mom, Dad stole property from elderly clients with dementia. This isn't a dispute, it's organized criminal activity." "Your father made mistakes in judgment, but he's not a criminal mastermind. The prosecutors are exaggerating the charges to make political points." Even now, facing overwhelming evidence and criminal charges, Mom was still trying to minimize the scope of Dad's crimes. "The evidence shows a systematic pattern of fraud spanning multiple years and multiple victims," I said. "This isn't a mistake in judgment, it's a criminal enterprise." "And you think sending your father to prison and destroying Brooke's future is appropriate punishment for financial mismanagement?" "I think holding people accountable for their crimes is how justice works, regardless of whether they're related to me." Mom leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Cassie, if you withdraw your complaint and agree to settle this civilly, the prosecutors might be willing to reduce the charges significantly." "Are you asking me to help cover up Dad's crimes?" "I'm asking you to consider the consequences of your choices. Your father could go to prison for 20 years. Brooke could lose her freedom during the best years of her life. Is recovering your inheritance worth destroying two people's futures?" The emotional manipulation was sophisticated, appealing to my sense of family loyalty while framing Dad and Brooke as victims of my vindictive pursuit of justice. "Mom, what about the actual victims? What about the elderly people Dad defrauded? Don't their families deserve justice?" "Those situations are more complicated than you understand. Sometimes estate planning involves difficult decisions that look suspicious to people who don't understand the full picture." "So you think Dad was legitimately helping elderly clients transfer millions of dollars to strangers?"
I think your father sometimes made imperfect decisions while trying to help clients navigate complex family situations. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Mom alternating between emotional appeals and sophisticated legal rationalizations. But her fundamental message was clear. Family loyalty should override concern for justice, and I should prioritize protecting Dad and Brooke over holding them accountable for their crimes. I understand that you want to protect your family, but they committed serious crimes, and there are other victims besides me. I can't withdraw my complaint and pretend this never happened. Then you're choosing to destroy your family. No, I'm choosing not to participate in covering up their crimes. Dad and Brooke destroyed our family when they decided to build their wealth on fraud and theft.
Mom left the coffee shop without saying goodbye, and I knew that conversation represented the end of any possibility of family reconciliation. But I felt relief rather than sadness, because it confirmed that I'd made the right choice in pursuing justice. The pre-trial proceedings moved quickly. Dad's expensive defense team tried every possible strategy to dismiss or reduce the charges, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the prosecution was determined to send a message about elder abuse. Mr. Lawson explained the various legal maneuvers and their likely outcomes, helping me understand how the criminal case would affect my civil claim to recover the stolen property. The criminal conviction will make your civil case much easier, he said during one of our meetings. Once the court establishes that the property transfer was fraudulent, recovering ownership becomes a straightforward matter. How long will the criminal case take? Probably 6 to 8 months if it goes to trial, but there's a good chance your father will accept a plea deal rather than risk conviction on all charges. What kind of plea deal? Given the evidence and the number of victims, probably 8 to 12 years in prison, plus full restitution to all victims. The idea of Dad spending a decade in prison was sobering, but so was the realization that his crimes had affected multiple families and caused significant financial harm to vulnerable people. 4 months after the arrests, Dad's defense team approached the prosecution about a plea agreement. The negotiations were complex, involving restitution calculations for all the victims and agreements about cooperation with ongoing investigations into other potentially fraudulent transactions. Your father has agreed to plead guilty to multiple felony charges in exchange for a sentence of 10 years in prison, Mr. Lawson informed me. He'll also be required to make full restitution to all victims and surrender his law license permanently. What about Brooke? She's accepting a plea deal for 3 years in prison plus probation. She'll also be required to cooperate with efforts to recover stolen property and identify other potential victims. The plea agreements meant that I wouldn't have to testify in a lengthy trial, but they also meant that the full scope of Dad's criminal enterprise might never be completely exposed in open court. Are you satisfied with these outcomes? Mr. Lawson asked. I'm satisfied that justice is being served and that other families will get their property back. The specific sentences matter less than the principle that these crimes have consequences. The formal sentencing hearing was held on a cold morning in November, almost exactly 1 year after I'd first requested property records from Linda Morrison. I sat in the courthouse gallery watching Dad and Brooke learn their fates while surrounded by the families of their other victims. Judge Patricia Henley addressed the defendants directly before imposing sentences. Mr. Whitmore, you used your position as an attorney to systematically defraud vulnerable elderly clients who trusted you with their most important financial decisions. You betrayed that trust for personal gain and caused immeasurable harm to families who believed they could rely on your professional integrity. Miss Whitmore, while your role in this conspiracy was less extensive than your father's, you knowingly benefited from property that was stolen through fraud. Your decision to proceed with business plans using stolen property shows a callous disregard for your victims' rights. Dad received 10 years in prison, as agreed in the plea deal,
Brooke received 3 years plus 5 years of probation. Both were ordered to pay restitution totaling over $3 million to the various victims. But beyond the criminal sentences, Judge Henley ordered immediate restoration of all fraudulently transferred property to its rightful owners. The Oakwood Hills property that had started this entire investigation was officially transferred back to my name that afternoon. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that justice had been served, sadness about the destruction of my family relationships, and pride that I'd trusted my instincts and pursued the truth despite enormous pressure to accept comfortable lies. Linda Morrison, who had attended the sentencing hearing, approached me on the courthouse steps. "Cassie, I want you to know that your case has led to significant changes in how our office reviews property transfers. We've implemented new verification procedures that should make this kind of fraud much more difficult in the future." "That's wonderful. Maybe other families won't have to go through what mine did." Your willingness to fight for the truth, even when it meant confronting your own family, has probably prevented dozens of future victims. You should be proud of what you've accomplished. 6 months later, I stood on the front porch of Grandma Dorothy's Victorian house, holding the keys to property that was finally, legally, and indisputably mine. The house needed some renovation work after years of neglect, but the bones were solid and the location was as beautiful as I remembered. I'd decided to honor Grandma Dorothy's memory by converting the property into a retreat center for families dealing with elder abuse and financial exploitation. Working with social services and legal aid organizations, I was creating a place where families could get education about protecting elderly relatives and support for pursuing justice when crimes occurred. The irony wasn't lost on me that Brooke's original bed and breakfast concept had been transformed into something that helped prevent the very crimes she and Dad had committed. Mr. Lawson had become both a friend and a mentor, helping me understand the legal complexities of elder abuse and financial exploitation. Together, we'd started giving presentations to community groups about recognizing and preventing fraud against vulnerable seniors. "You've become quite an expert on this topic," he observed after one of our presentations to a senior center. "I never wanted to be an expert on fraud, but since I am, I might as well use that knowledge to help other people."
You've turned your personal tragedy into a tool for preventing other tragedies. That takes remarkable strength and character. The girl who had once doubted her own perceptions when family members dismissed her concerns had become a woman who trusted her instincts and used her experience to help others navigate similar situations. I maintained no contact with my immediate family members. Mom had moved to another state after Dad's sentencing, unable to face the community where her family's crimes had been so publicly exposed. The family farmhouse was sold to pay restitution to fraud victims, and the Whitmore name became synonymous with betrayal rather than success in Millfield County. But I'd built new relationships with the families of Dad's other victims, people who understood the complex emotions involved in discovering that loved ones were capable of serious crimes. We supported each other through the legal processes and shared strategies for rebuilding trust and security after experiencing such fundamental betrayals. 2 years after the arrests, I received an unexpected letter from Brooke, who was nearing the end of her prison sentence. "Cassie, I know I have no right to contact you, and I don't expect you to respond, but I wanted you to know that I've had a lot of time to think about what I did and why I did it. You were right about everything. Dad and I did steal your inheritance, and we did it because we thought we could get away with it. We convinced ourselves that we were better suited to manage the property, but the truth is, we just wanted to control something valuable that belonged to you. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I know that what we did was unforgivable, but I wanted you to know that you were right to pursue justice, even when it meant destroying our family. The family we had was built on lies, and you were the only one brave enough to insist on the truth. I hope your retreat center helps prevent other families from going through what ours did. Brooke."
I read the letter several times, surprised by its directness and apparent sincerity. It was the first acknowledgement from any family member that my pursuit of justice had been appropriate rather than vindictive. I never responded to the letter, but I kept it as a reminder of how completely my understanding of my family had evolved. The people I'd once trusted most had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. But that betrayal had taught me valuable lessons about the difference between family loyalty and enabling criminal behavior. 3 years after exposing the fraud, I stood in the renovated Victorian house that had become the Dorothy Richardson Center for Elder Justice, watching families participate in workshops about protecting vulnerable relatives from financial exploitation. The quiet daughter who had once accepted vague explanations about estate planning had become an advocate who taught other people to ask hard questions, demand documentation, and trust their instincts when something seemed wrong. The property that Brooke had planned to develop for profit had become a resource for families seeking justice and protection from the very crimes my family had committed. And Linda Morrison, the county assessor whose professional integrity had started this entire investigation, had become the center's first board member and strongest advocate for the systematic changes we were promoting. Looking back, I realized that my transformation hadn't begun with discovering the fraud. It had begun with the simple decision to trust my own instincts over my family's explanations. That choice had led to everything else: the investigation, the criminal charges, the recovery of my inheritance, and eventually the creation of something meaningful from the wreckage of my family's crimes. The girl who had once been afraid to challenge family authority had become a woman who understood that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is insist on the truth, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might be for the people you care about. And the property that had nearly been stolen through fraud had become a place where other families could learn to protect themselves from similar betrayals, ensuring that Grandma Dorothy's legacy lived on in ways that honored her values rather than enriching the people who had tried to steal from her memory. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.